This morning's lesson is from the New Testament letter to the Ephesians, chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. For once you were darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what such people do secretly. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible. For everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, "Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Because my wife, Nina, works at a hospital and is more likely to come in contact with the coronavirus, she suggested that it might not be a bad idea for me to go ahead and move into the guest bedroom at our house. We human beings are creatures of habit. I'm accustomed to rolling out of bed in the morning on my right side, and in the bedroom where Nina and I sleep, we keep a light on in the closet with the closet doors almost shut so that if we get up in the night, we can find our way safely out of the room. However, in our guest bedroom, if I were to roll out of bed on my right side in this dark room which does not have a usable light in the closet, I would first walk directly into a large bookcase. If I somehow managed to avoid the bookcase, between it and the door are two large sets of metal shelves filled with food, because this bedroom doubles now as a kind of extra pantry. So when I needed to move into this guest bedroom, I went online and ordered 2 night lights, because if I got 2, it was a bargain, and my mother taught me long ago to take advantage of bargains. None of you are surprised at all at the way this story ends with me getting night lights, because when it's dark and you need to find your way, you get a light. Light enables us to see and to find our way in the dark. It isn't clear whether this letter to the Ephesians was written by St. Paul or by one of his followers writing in his name. That would not have been uncommon in those days, but we'll call the writer Paul, and it may well have been. He uses this idea of light and darkness to talk about the way followers of Jesus should live their whole lives, not in the dark, but in the light that Jesus shows us as God's way to live. This chapter in Ephesians begins, "Be imitators of God." One of the statements made about God in the New Testament is in that little letter of 1 John. God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Christians believe that in the life and teachings of Jesus, we see our clearest picture of what God is like. In his gospel, John tells us that Jesus said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." But Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, tells his followers, "You are the light of the world, and let your light shine before others." Somehow, Jesus' light gets transferred to us. Think of light as having the quality of heat to it. One of the old examples of something like this is that of a steel sword. Take the sword and thrust it into a hot fire. Left there long enough, the sword takes on a red glow. The property of heat transfers to the sword. In seeking to follow Jesus closely, putting ourselves in close proximity to Jesus as we walk through life, something of his heat, something of his light gets transferred to us. We may not shine as brightly as Jesus, but we do shine. We are to be, like Jesus, light in the world. You and I are called to bear this light of Jesus, to reflect it out of our lives and into the lives of others and into the life of the world. Others will, Jesus says in that Sermon on the Mount, see our good works, and God will be honored by that. At least sometimes, however, it isn't good enough to walk in the light ourselves, but verse 11 in our lesson tells us that not only should we take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, instead we should expose them. Now, that doesn't mean that we always want to expose everyone else's secrets, not at all. But some things do need to be brought into the light, exposed. The most famous traitor in American history was surely Benedict Arnold. His name has become a synonym for the word traitor, and to be called a Benedict Arnold is not a good thing. In the Revolutionary War, Arnold was admired by George Washington and was a distinguished general in his own right. But he began secret negotiations with a British major to surrender the fort at West Point to the enemy. The British major was captured and hanged when the plot was exposed. Benedict Arnold escaped and was made a brigadier general in the British Army. Arnold then led British forces in battles on American soil. At least for Americans, Benedict Arnold's actions constituted treason. What he had done was exposed, however, was brought to light, and doing so kept the fort at West Point from falling into enemy hands. In some cases, it is certainly appropriate to shine light on something that is in the dark, to shine light on it and expose it, because otherwise it will do great harm or continue to do great harm. In the early 2000s, the Boston Globe newspaper exposed what we learned was widespread sexual abuse on the part of many priests in the Roman Catholic Church. And much of the abuse was covered up by others in the church. Sadly, those kinds of things happen in all churches and denominations. But the size of the Roman Catholic Church and the scale on which this happened pointed the finger more directly at them. The Boston Globe reporters who brought those stories to light, no doubt they prevented further abuse in many cases. Some dark things need to be exposed to the light so that an end can be put to the darkness. Let me say one more time, that does not mean that anything someone has done that I might find offensive needs to be exposed or revealed. Christians always need to practice discernment, good judgment, but personally, we are always to seek to be people of light and not darkness. There is a beautiful piece of classical music, a chorale by Bach, called Sleeper Wake, or sometimes Sleeper Awake. The title sounds very much like this last line in our lesson, verse 14, which likely was a part of a baptismal service in the early church. Sleeper awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Imagine those words being spoken as someone who has decided to follow Jesus and is laid beneath the water of a river, then is brought back up. Sleeper awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Awaken from your old life, a life of darkness, awaken to your new life, following Jesus in the light, and Jesus will shine on you. Clarence Jordan, in his paraphrase of this lesson, described what it might look like in practical terms. Behave as people of light, because this kind of light produces goodness and uprightness and truth. Jesus, of course, was a Jewish prophet, and he practiced the religious faith into which he had been born. Our Christian religion is a branch off the tree of Judaism. Henryk Goldschmidt was a Jewish pediatrician and teacher in Poland who in the late 1930s opened an orphanage in Warsaw for Jewish children. When the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, although he didn't have to, Henryk stayed with the children from his orphanage when they were interned in the ghetto area. Some 3 years later, the order came down for the orphans to be transported to a death camp. Goldschmidt marched with his orphans to the train station, boarded the train with them, and soon after they all arrived at the camp, died in a gas chamber with his orphans. In some of the darkest days in human history, Henryk Goldschmidt stood out as a light. His story is still being told today. His light is still shining. He practiced goodness and uprightness and truth. Not all goodness, however, is as dramatic as that. Such a sacrifice may never be required from most of us, but a person of light does practice goodness, often a simple goodness. If you know me, probably you know that I am a picky eater. Perhaps because I had food allergies as a kid, I continue to be finicky when it comes to food. When I graduated from seminary and became pastor of my first church, it was a small rural congregation, and many of the women in that church were very good cooks. They figured out pretty quickly, however, that when it came to food, I was just weird. I remember the first time I went with that congregation to our denomination's assembly grounds up in the North Carolina mountains. I had no idea when the meal was served by the staff there whether there would be anything I wanted to eat. The ladies from my church, however, had prepared desserts and brought them along. They were displayed on a table there in the dining room. A dear, sweet lady named Elizabeth took me to the dessert table and showed me the pie she had made. It was peanut butter pie, and she knew how much I loved peanut butter. There would be something for me to eat that night, even if it was just too much peanut butter pie. That may be a less dramatic story, but in my book, fixing that pie for me was an example of doing good, of shining Elizabeth's little light, at least into my world. Whether what you do is big or small or somewhere in between, shine. Practice what is good and right and true. For once you were darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what such people do secretly. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible. For everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, "Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." As you follow Jesus, perhaps you can remember that old Sunday school song many of us learned as children. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. You are the light of the world. Be the light of the world. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Shine. Amen.
Sing this little light of mine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I've gotta let it shine. Shine, let it shine. Shine, let it shine.
Little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, yes, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.